You're listening to BQN. Assimilate the audio.
Good morning. I'm Chrissie De Clerck-Szilagyi.
And I'm Jason Szilagyi with today's Caffeinated History with the Szilagyis on the BQN Podcast Collective.
Before we jump into our topic for the day, we'd like to take a moment to thank our BQN Patreon patrons who make this show possible. Listeners, you can hear your name listed here as one of our associate producers with a monthly subscription of just $10 at patreon.com/BQN. And with a monthly Patreon subscription of just $5 or more, you can join our Meetings of the Hive Mind on the second Saturday of each month. Watch your Patreon messages for details. Today's topic is the life of Gaius Marius, Part 1. When one thinks of great Roman generals, the first one who usually comes to mind is Gaius Julius Caesar. But as successful as he was, he followed the lead of two other men, Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Marius created the Roman soldier which Caesar used, and Sulla created the precedent of using those soldiers to invade their home city for his benefit. Gaius Marius was what the Romans called a novus homo, a new man, the first in his family to reach the highest office of the Roman Republic, the consulship. He was often described by his contemporaries as provincial and a man who knew no Greek, a generic insult that meant he had no formal education. While it is true he did come from a farming family in the rural area of Arpinum, and his family was not one of the elite patrician families, he did have a formal education. But Plutarch tells us he never bothered to completely learn Greek because he saw no use in learning the language of a conquered people. Though his family was not rich, they did have enough resources to equip Marius to join the army. In that era, the Roman army was an all-volunteer force who equipped themselves. Because of this, there was a minimum property requirement. Also, these soldiers were not paid. They expected to get a share of the spoils. The base of the army, its infantry, was comprised of the sons of the small-holding farming families from across Italy, who volunteered to protect their country and expected nothing in return. This reflects the ideology of war for Rome in this era. They only got involved if they were invaded, for defense. They did not conquer. This changed with the Punic Wars. The Punic Wars are a series of conflicts fought between Rome and Carthage, beginning in 246 BCE and ending with Rome's complete destruction of the city of Carthage in 146. Over the course of this near century, Rome moved away from an ideology of purely defensive wars to the conquest of the Mediterranean. This conquest enriched some Romans as never before, and, keeping to their agrarian roots, many purchased land. The land had been owned by smallholders who found themselves impoverished while fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers fought for Rome. These small farms were brought together into huge plantations called latifundia, and these rich men did not hire the newly landless to work on these farms. They used the enslaved spoils of the conquest. They also added parts of the agri publicus where they could. These were the public lands that were supposed to be available to everyone for grazing livestock and other public use. Within a generation of the final destruction of Carthage, the Roman army was feeling the effects of this shift in land ownership. No longer could Rome rely on volunteers who kidded themselves. There simply weren't enough of them. The difference could be made up for a while with the armies of the Socii, the allies of Italy. This, however, would create its own problems, ones that Marius would fight firsthand. Gaius Marius rose through the ranks, making a name for himself politically at the same time. He, like many political men who came from plebeian, lower-class families, had help from a patrician patron. Marius's patron was the Metelli family, and he worked closely with Quintus Caecilius Metellus. After his election as plebeian tribune in 120 BCE, he began to alienate them with his opposing political stances. He felt he did not need them anymore, and hoped that people would forget that he'd ever needed a patron in the first place. However, this opposition cost him the aedileship a few years later, and would present further problems down the road. After a term as propraetor in further Spain, he returned to Rome in 113. He was now very wealthy, but still lacked the social bona fides of the senatorial class, so he married a Julia. This showed Rome without question that he was respectable. If a family as ancient as the Julio Caesari, a family who traced their lineage to Aeneas and through him the goddess Venus, allowed one of their daughters to marry him, the rest of the patricians could not keep him on the outside. His new wife's family benefited as well, gaining an influx of funds that allowed Julia's brothers to have political careers in line with their social rank, something the family had not managed in a few generations. And without this, Julia's nephew, Gaius Julius, might never have gained the heights for which he is known, and which made the family name a byword for emperor. The marriage seems to have been a happy one, at least as far as arranged marriages go. They had only one child who survived to adulthood, Gaius Marius the Younger. In 109, Marius traveled to Numidia to become legate to his former patron, Quintus Metellus, who was one of Rome's generals in the Jugurthine War. There was still enmity between the two men, and this was exacerbated by their very different ways of conducting themselves with the soldiers. Metellus stayed distant and commanding, but Marius shared the work with those in his command. His willingness to do so, and to share in the poor provisions and quartering, earned him the respect and admiration of many, and did nothing to endear Metellus to them. This military reputation is one on which he would capitalize for both Rome and himself in later years. As the summer of 108 came on, Marius requested leave to return to Rome in order to present himself as a candidate for the consulship. Metellus refused to let him go, and mocked him by saying he should wait a little while longer until he could stand with Metellus's young son as a colleague. Young Metellus was 20 years away from being eligible for the office. But Quintus Metellus was faced with an increasingly ornery legate, and one who knew that the majority of the soldiers backed him over their mutual commander. So he finally released him, just when he thought it would take Marius too long to get back to Rome in time for the elections. He was wrong. Marius was elected as one of the consuls for the year 107 BCE. He had hoped to take the Numidian command from Metellus, not only for any personal reasons that existed between them, but because he truly thought he could conduct the war more successfully. And he wasn't wrong. However, the Senate refused to take the generalship away from Metellus, and so Marius arranged for a tribune to put the matter in front of the People's Assembly, as the Gracchi had done with their reform efforts a few decades previously. The people voted in favor of Marius, and Quintus Caecilius Metellus was removed from his command. Marius's next step was to recruit more soldiers, and finding the usual methods difficult, he began to recruit from the landless citizens in Rome, the caput censi, or the head count, so called because they had nothing but their citizenship, by which they were counted and included in the rolls of citizens. He had to get special permission from the Senate for this recruitment, because these men would require a great deal more training than the traditional volunteers, and would also need to be equipped and paid. This was the beginning of the professional Roman army, with standardized training, uniforms, equipment, and pay. This method proved its worth in Marius's defeat of Jugurtha the following year. Also key to that defeat was Marius's quaestor, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, whose connections gave him access to the court of Bacchus, king of Mauritania and father-in-law to Jugurtha. It was through Bacchus that Jugurtha was ultimately captured, and it was Sulla who accepted his surrender. But here again we see Marius's disregard for social status. Sulla was of a noble patrician family, one that had become impoverished and almost disappeared. He sought to reattain the family's position, and so wanted at least some credit for the successful end of the war. Marius refused even a small acknowledgement. This was his right in terms of tradition and legality, as he was the commanding officer, but a small concession here might have saved Marius a great deal of difficulty later on. We will pick up the life of Marius in part 2 in our next episode. Thank you so much for listening. We'd also like to thank our History with the Szilagys Patreon patrons Laura Dull and Susan Capuzzi-De Clerck. Their contributions help us to have the time to research and write what you're hearing. You can help us just like they do with a monthly subscription at patreon.com/historywiththeszilagys. Also, thank you to Mark White for the awesome show art and Zach Tripp for wonderful closing music. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast player, and don't forget to rate and review us there as well. And while you're at it, check out the rest of the great shows on the BQN Collective. We'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to reach out, you can find our network on the website formerly known as Twitter at BQN Podcasts, and this podcast in particular at History Szilagyi. You can also talk about any and all of the BQN podcasts in our Facebook group, the BQN Collective. And last but not least, you can find me on that same website formerly known as Twitter at the Goddess Livia. That's TheGoddessLivia.
And me at Jason Dark Elf. We'd love to hear topic suggestions. What would you like to learn on Caffeinated History?